Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Wendy Cromash. Thank you for tuning in to today's Levy lecture. I am really excited to welcome our guest, Jill Wine-Banks, author of the Watergate Girl, analyst on MSNBC, legal analyst on MSNBC, and it's just going to be a very lively and interesting discussion. Thank you, Levy Senior Center Foundation, for sponsoring us. We could not hold the Levy lectures without the foundation support and without the support of generous people like yourselves who've given so wonderfully over the past couple of years. Today's format is we have some slide pictures to share with you and discuss, but primarily we're going to be hearing Jill read from her book and answer questions. So that's the format. Jill Wine-Banks is an MSNBC legal analyst. She appears regularly on the network's primetime and daytime shows. She began her career as an organized crime prosecutor in the US Department of Justice, which led to her selection as one of 3 assistant special prosecutors in the trial of President Richard Nixon's top aides for obstruction of justice in the Watergate scandal. She has also served as general counsel of the US Army, Solicitor General and Deputy Attorney General of the state of Illinois, and Chief Operating Officer at the American Bar Association. In each of those cases, she was the first woman to hold the position. She's a graduate of the University of Illinois and Columbia Law School. It's my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Levy Center. Thank you to my cousin Lauren, who introduced me to you, Wendy.
Yes, thank you,
and
Lauren.
Thank you to so many people who have turned on this program. I'm really impressed with that number. And I want to thank the Levy Center because it's where I got my vaccine shots. So
Great.
Thank you all.
Great. We're a big supporter of vaccinations. Okay, so you and I have talked. I have identified at least 2 sections of the book that I would like you to read. But people, it's a great book. It's easy to read and so interesting. Complex subjects and aspects of the law are explained easily so that you don't have to go to law school to read and enjoy the book. And it's just a bird's eye view of a tremendous part of history. So Jill, why don't you begin with reading something from your book, please?
Okay, tell me what you'd like me to start with.
Let's start with Jeb.
Okay, what page is that?
Jeb, hang on 1 second. I have that written down over here.
While you're looking, I have a picture of Jeb and me in court, a drawing, but you'll have to actually get the book. It's a little hard to see on the.
Okay, 26, 27.
26 and 27. Okay.
That's where it starts.
Okay, yes. It's a chapter called The Watergate Boy, which seemed appropriate since I was called the Watergate Girl. For our trial team, the first task was to master the mountain of documents that had landed at our door. We started by reading records of the burglary investigation and the transcripts of the burglary trial. We kept up with the ongoing press reports, checked out rumors, and most important, reviewed documents and interviewed witnesses. White House and CREEP officials, eager to avoid indictments as the evidence against the administration mounted, started clamoring to talk to us in the hope of receiving more lenient sentences. One of those men was Jeb Stewart Magruder. I met Magruder on my first day on the job when his lawyer brought him to our office to discuss a plea deal. Magruder, a young member of Nixon's inner circle, had worked at the White House as a communications aide before becoming deputy campaign chairman for Nixon's re-election. He was tall and athletic and good-looking, with abundant dark brown hair and droopy, long-lashed blue eyes. He looked much younger than his 38 years. We settled into chairs in Jim Neal's office. And by the way, Jim Neal was the senior person on the Watergate trial team that it also included Rick Membanista. And Jim asked whether anyone wanted coffee. Magruder and his lawyer turned to me, the only woman in the room, and simultaneously said, "I'll take mine black." Jim fixed his gaze on Magruder, while George Frampton, the junior lawyer in the room, ran to fetch coffee. Jim drawled, talking around his cigar, "Not very smart, insulting a major player in deciding the terms of your plea agreement." I was used to sexist assumptions, but what I wasn't used to was Magruder's utter amorality. He had lied and lied and lied to the FBI, to the Justice Department investigators, to a federal grand jury, to Judge Sirica. His name had first come up during the burglars' trial in January when he testified under oath that he knew nothing about the outrageous plan cooked up by G. Gordon Liddy to sabotage the Democrats, which would culminate in the DNC break-in. Magruder also said on the witness stand that he'd instructed all of Creep's employees not to do anything embarrassing or illegal that would make the president's reelection difficult. Magruder said this with a straight face while maintaining eye contact with the prosecutor questioning him, and with his voice firm. Lying was as natural to him as breathing.
Yeah, it's an amazing description of someone who was completely, he was practically immoral. And
there were so many examples of that. And because I worked so closely with him, he became my witness. I mean, I could tell you hundreds of stories about what a baby he was and why I never really fully trusted him. I would not let him answer any questions on the stand that I hadn't corroborated through documents or other witness testimony, because he just, unlike John Dean, who recognized the illegality and immorality of what he had done, Jeb Magruder was just sort of mad that he got caught, not ever recognizing that what he did was really a terrible thing, that it was destructive of democracy and justice. So to me, they were very different people. As you can see, I assume these pictures are up for everyone to see. There's one picture of Jeb at the time that I knew him. And then he later became, to my shock, a minister. I would never have predicted that, because obviously if you think someone's amoral, you would not think they would go into a religious calling. I don't think actually he changed much. And what I've read is that he became an alcoholic and died from that. He also ended up divorced. Another thing I would not have predicted, because he and his wife, Gail, seemed to have a really good relationship. And in all the time I worked with him, I would let her come over and let them have lunch together. He was in prison. And I thought that was, nice to be able to give him a break and give her a break. And that's who I found him to be, but he ended up being a very, very important witness. He had some key information, particularly linking, he was the deputy to John Mitchell at the campaign. And so he became a very key witness against John Mitchell.
And what I read after...
Wendy, someone
yes.
said that you need to go to full screen on the slides because people aren't seeing them.
I'm sorry.
So it's okay if they don't see us. Hi there, this is us.
Hang on one sec.
I don't know how to do it, but.
I thought I was on full screen.
You're not. I'm seeing a slideshow, so I see the upcoming slides as well.
Okay, hang on.
Well, now they said we can see the slides, but they can't see me.
Okay, I'm going to hide myself because you all know what I look like. And
someone say if you can see me now. We can see both slides and Jill. Okay. So
Okay.
everything's good.
So I can see her on the slides. Okay. So Kathy says it's fine. So I'm going to go with that.
Okay.
Okay. So the description that you just read, I found so striking, and I was curious to see what became of him the rest of his life. And not only did he divorce Gail, he married and then divorced that woman, ended up staying with his third wife, which is, no judgment, people.
No.
That's an
I certainly
optimist.
wouldn't judge.
Right. Exactly. But he gave subsequent interviews that contradicted what he had told you, and then contradicted himself. He kept changing the story, even, toward the end of his life. So he really didn't seem to learn whatever lesson there was, or, gain any self-awareness from the experience. He continued whatever bad behaviors he was doing. Did you have contact with him after the trial, after he went to prison, or?
No, never. After he testified and went back to jail, I never saw him. I do describe, and I'm still seeing a lot of chat things saying that it's not in the right view. There's a presentation view. I'll leave that to you to read them. I hope people are seeing something now. The last time I saw him was when he testified during the trial, and he was already in federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania in what was known as a sort of country club kind of place. It was, a minimum security facility. And of course, I had him brought to Washington so that I could prepare him for trial. Anyone who's watching the Chauvin trial knows that the prosecutors spend a lot of time preparing witnesses so that they can answer concisely, accurately, and truthfully, but concisely, and not roam and wander and ramble. And the first day he came in after he was brought to DC, he walked into my office. He sat down across from me in a chair opposite mine and started sobbing hysterically. I mean, the kind of crying where his head was on my desk. He was heaving. And Jeb, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he literally couldn't speak. And the only thing I could think of was that he had been raped at the DC jail, which was not anything like the federal penitentiary. And I also knew he would never tell me, a woman, if that had happened. And I honestly thought he wouldn't tell Rick or Jim either. And I went and got the oldest person who worked for us, a man named Tony Passaretti, who was an IRS agent working on our team, and said, Tony, you have to find out what's wrong. And Tony went in, and I waited and waited, and Tony comes out and he says, nope, that's not it. He just didn't sleep well because the lights were on and television was going. And to me, that also captures who Jeb was in terms of his entitlement and the type of person he was. Now, of course, I had to respond to that because I needed him to be alert and able to work with me. So I had him transferred to Fort Holabird, which was a U.S. Army facility that had a brig where it was really safe and he'd be alone in a room. And so that's where he spent the rest of the time during the trial.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Let's move off from Jeb and John Dean. John Dean, you described as having a really fantastic memory, very preppy and, buttoned up. And you needed corroboration of what he told you had taken place. And that came through when your office became aware of the taping system in the White House. Go on.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I just was going to say that I'm still seeing chats about now they're seeing my name, but not me. Maybe we should change between shared screen and just you and me, and go back to the shared screen when you have a question about the screen. Oh, well, now someone says we can see you, Jill. I can see Jill and the slides. I don't know. Okay, just
Jill,
keep going.
I would don't pay any attention.
I'm ignoring them. I'm ignoring them. So John Dean, yes. You know, the real issue is that when you have the president of the United States as a target of your investigation, as a possible defendant, the standard of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, becomes even higher than beyond a reasonable doubt. And the witnesses against that person, whoever is in a position that important, but it's hard to think of someone higher up than the president, you need a witness who is totally credible. And everything that John Dean said from his fantastic memory, because he was ushered out of the White House, he was fired and ushered out without any documents, and he didn't have diaries. This was done from his memory. He was incredible, and he was totally believable, and it was all consistent with things we knew. But we also knew if it was John Dean testifying against the president, and he said the president did this, I told the president that, and the president said the opposite, the benefit of the doubt would go to the president, and we would not have a conviction. And we learned about the taping system the same way everyone in America did on television when Butterfield testified. And something few people know is he actually informed the Senate committee, which was having hearings at the same time as we were just appointed and starting our investigation. They interviewed him on Friday, and it was kept secret until Monday when Alex Butterfield testified that there was a taping system. That's pretty unusual in Washington, that something that big would remain secret for that long. And so when we heard it on Monday, our immediate reaction within minutes of hearing it was, we have to subpoena tapes. If there are tapes of John Dean saying, as he, for example, had told us on March 21st, I told the president there's a cancer on the presidency. That's pretty compelling evidence, since the president said he didn't know for forever. Well, if you could hear John Dean telling him before he admitted he knew, that would be pretty significant. So we got together a list of tapes. We picked 9, and only 9, and we needed to pick tapes that would survive any claim of presidential immunity, of presidential privilege, which is a legitimate privilege. And so we picked mostly conversations that involved John Dean that he had testified about. And by the way, when he testified before the Senate committee, the Irvin committee, no one knew there were tapes, including John Dean. So here he was out on a limb, having told his version without the benefit of reviewing tapes. And if he was wrong, even on saying, I said this on March 21st, if it turned out to be March 30th, his credibility would be weakened. And so it was really important. He happened to be working with us in our office the day we found out. And he was like, yes, let's get them. And so we subpoenaed them. And of course, that's a whole nother story, which, if you want to know about, we can talk about how we selected them and then what the fight became, which led to a tapes hearing, to the Saturday Night Massacre, etc.
Okay.
But, you asked about John and comparing him. John really did recognize the mistakes he had made and regretted them and was willing to work really hard with us. I mean, he literally, instead of serving time in prison, was serving time working every day in our office. And he was, for us, what a computer would be today. There were sort of an early version of computers, but nothing like what we have today. So if you needed to know something, you'd go in and say, well, John, what about, and he would give you the answer. So he was like an early responder computer.
And he was doing this all from his memory, not from
Yes.
any notes or.
No, eventually, of course, we did get tapes, and that helped refresh his recollection even better. But yeah, I mean, and let me just say, in all of his testimony, and remember, he did this without notes, without, he prepared his own draft for the Senate. The only mistake he made that I have ever found out about was he said something happened at the Mayflower Hotel, a very famous landmark in Washington on Connecticut Avenue. In fact, it became part of the Mueller investigation because Jeff Sessions had conversations with a Russian there. He said it happened at the Mayflower Hotel. It actually happened in the Mayflower coffee shop of a different hotel. So Mayflower Hotel, Mayflower coffee shop, it's a difference without meaning. But, if I'm looking for, did he make a mistake? That was it. That's pretty amazing. And there's actually also a conversation between Haldeman and the president, in which the president says, John Dean's acting weird lately. Do you think he's recording us? And then they go on to say, nah, he wears those tight Italian suits, and if he was wearing a wire, we'd see it. And all the time they're taping themselves having that conversation without any awareness that they were taping themselves.
Were Haldeman and Ehrlichman aware of the taping system?
No. The president and Butterfield and the Secret Service, eventually Haldeman did learn about it, but not early on. Even Rosemary Woods did not know about it until pretty much the end. So it was a very well kept secret. And it was partly, because he wanted to get the president, when I say he, thought that he could use these tapes to write a memoir, to write a history book. And he wanted to capture honest dialogue without anyone filtering what they said because they knew they were being taped.
Okay. Do you think it ever occurred to him just to burn them all?
To the president?
Yes.
He was advised to do that. And as I said, I think he thought they were valuable to him, that he could use them to write from. And so they had an economic value. And he also, of course, had the attitude, if I do it, it's not wrong, and I can get away with this. And he never thought he'd have to turn them over. And by the time he realized he might have to, it was too late. If he had burned them before we subpoenaed them, and it wasn't long, we're talking about days, but if he had burned them immediately, it wouldn't have been destruction of evidence. It wouldn't have been obstruction of justice. Once they were subpoenaed, they would have been an act of obstruction of justice to burn them.
Okay. Liza is asking, do you believe John Dean learned his lessons?
Yes, I definitely do. He and I, as I said, during Watergate, he was like a computer. I never had a personal conversation with him. I observed him, I observed Mo, and I do describe in the book one episode where, again, I would have not predicted their marriage would last, and they are still happily married. But I met him at maybe 10 years ago. We were on a panel together in Minnesota. And it was the first time that I realized, I was sitting down to lunch with him before the program, that we were having a conversation like two friends, two people maybe meeting each other for the first time. And I learned, by the way, that he lived in Evanston as a child. I never knew that from the Watergate era. And I learned that he is as mad for his dogs as I am for mine. And so it was really interesting. And whenever he would come to Chicago, we'd have lunch. My husband and I took him to Davis Street Fish Market, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. but many of you are Evanstonians and will probably remember it. And so we have become friends where we, exchange emails and, communicate pretty regularly. So I know him as an adult now, and he definitely is a person who has a moral fiber and who would not do what he did at the time.
Okay. John Mitchell, did you interview him or have any interactions with him?
Only in the courtroom, because he was a defendant. Of course, we did not spend much time with him because defense lawyers don't let prosecutors talk to their witness unless they are planning a plea deal. So all of the other defendants I interacted with. The courtroom, just to set the scene, is a typical federal courtroom with the kind of burnished reddish wood walls that the Chicago federal courthouse has. And if you have as many defendants and defense lawyers in the little area that's intended for lawyers, tables are pretty close together. So I basically sat side by side with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and not that far from John Mitchell, and had very clear views of them. So I definitely, observed them closely. I observed their families who were sitting behind the bar, just behind me. Haldeman's daughter took the year off. She was a freshman. She had finished a year of law school. And so she basically served as a paralegal for Haldeman's defense team. And I remember when we played the first tapes and everyone was handed headphones to listen to them, I felt so badly for her because you can only deny so much when you listen to the tapes. And to hear your father committing a crime real time just seems so painful to me. I really felt badly for her.
Yeah. That's painful to see someone you idolize.
Yes.
Be
of course,
taken down.
I saw the wives in the ladies' room. We did not, have conversations, but, at court breaks, there was one ladies' room, and so we all used the same public restroom. But other than that, I and I talked to all the defense lawyers, some of whom were a lot friendlier, did not see us as the enemy, but saw us as what we were, which was, trying to get to the truth and doing our job.
Okay. I have up on the screen, I hope it's up on the screen for everyone else. Can you see it, Joe?
I can't.
Okay.
But just if you tell me what it is, I'll know it.
The wives of Watergate.
Yes.
Pictures of Maureen Dean,
right,
Martha Mitchell, and the woman Dorothy Hunt, who was killed in the plane crash, and $10,000 in cash was found on her person. Hang on one second. All right. Hang on.
I know the picture, so it doesn't matter if I see it.
Well, but my audience doesn't. So
they're saying only seeing Jill.
All right. Hang on. Okay, sharing screen.
There we go.
Screen. Okay.
Okay, I'm seeing here. Rosemary. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Yeah, I mean, what a cast of characters. If you were writing a novel, these are people you would invent. They are iconic. Dorothy Hunt, who was first of all, you would start with Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy. You could not create more colorful people than those two men. And then you can add to that the Cuban Americans, and McCord And
You're,
yeah, so McCord is the first in, those are the mug shots of the men arrested. The picture in the lower right-hand corner is on the right side of it is the Watergate complex, which includes the hotel and the office building. The little white building in the lower left-hand corner is the Howard Johnson Hotel, which Liddy used as the watching point. The idea, and the person hired to do that was actually watching television and got distracted. He was supposed to be watching during the break-in so that he could call if he saw a guard coming into an office adjacent or the police arriving. He was watching television, and when the police arrived, did not use his walkie-talkie to alert the burglars, and so they got caught in the Democratic National Committee offices there. The hotel, by the way, has now been updated and upgraded, and it's a fabulous place. Anybody visiting Washington, in the upper right-hand corner is the Kennedy Center, and the Potomac River. You can, yeah, that's the Potomac River. It's a great place to stay. Fabulous. Anyway, McCord, who's the first of the mugshots. The others are Cuban Americans, and they were the ones caught in the headquarters. Liddy and Hunt were identified later through a variety of means, but McCord gave a alias when he was arrested. It only took about a day to find out that he was actually the chief of security for CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which should have been a clarion call to everyone that this was not an ordinary burglary, that this was a political act. It was the DNC, and the CREEP security officer was one of the burglars. And they had $100 bills in their pocket, brand new $100 bills. That money became the reason for the saying, follow the money, because that money was the result of one of the Cuban Americans in Florida cashing a campaign check. And the money, if the FBI had not been stopped by the CIA, which is one of the, it is actually what is known as a smoking gun tape, where you hear the discussion of use the CIA to stop the FBI. Yeah, just say that it's national security and they can't go into it. The dollar bills would have been identified as coming from CREEP. That would have been proof positive that the burglary was paid for by CREEP. And then once you got Hunt involved, Hunt worked in the White House. Gordon Liddy had worked in the White House, but was at the time of the burglary working for CREEP. So then McCord doesn't get the credit. The burglars were tried, those 5 plus Hunt and Liddy. And after the conviction, Judge Sirica, who was the trial judge for that as well as for our case, was about to sentence them, and McCord, in an effort to get a better deal, wrote a letter to Judge Sirica saying, all of your suspicions are correct. Hush money was paid to keep us from telling the truth. Perjury was committed in the courtroom, etc. So he really is the first person. He preceded John Dean in laying out the fact that there was a cover-up. And he said there were higher-ups involved. That was the real clue. That was in March. By May, the Senate had appointed the Special Select Committee under Senator Ervin, and had created the Watergate Special Prosecutor and appointed Archibald Cox. And then he had immediately hired, he was appointed and officially sworn in like on May 23rd, and within days we were hired. So that's how it all came to be. And I really credit McCord for that action. And yes, he did it for personal reasons to try to get a better deal, but nonetheless, he did it.
Did he get a better deal?
He probably did, yes. He did. It's not like he got off.
Right.
He didn't, but he did get a better deal than he would have otherwise.
And do we know the name of the person who was supposed to be watching from Howard Johnson's who?
Yes, I think it was Tony Lassowitz, another unbelievably phenomenal character. He talked like a mob boss. Um, he was from New York, and um, he also went to jail, but he also got out. I don't remember the details now, but yeah, it was, and I even at one point knew what television show he said what he was watching that he got. It was some stupid show. I mean, quite amazing. But the burglars themselves were, these were professionals. The Cuban Americans had all been part of the Bay of Pigs invasion, but they taped a door in a way that anybody would have seen it. And that was the first clue that alerted the guard who did regular patrols. And by the way, they stayed in the Watergate Hotel the night before the break-in. And that room is now, you can rent the room they stayed in, which has some of the equipment that was captured when they were identified and the FBI came and did it. You can rent it for thousands of dollars a night, or you can take a tour with the phenomenal doorman. And the hotel has been redone by the costumes that the bellmen wear, that the desk clerks wear, that the doormen wear, are designed by the same person who did Mad Men costumes, and they're of the period. The hotel name is now written in big letters, not as big as the Trump Tower in Chicago, not that size, but pretty big letters. But it's done in a typewriter font, and they're a little off, askew, as when if anybody remembers manual typewriters, the letters were never quite as perfect as they are on a computer. And so they've really captured.
And this is the Howard
that
Johnson's you're talking about?
No, this is the Watergate Hotel now.
Okay.
So the Watergate Hotel has the room that the burglars stayed in. Lassowitz, Liddy, Hunt were using a room at the Howard Johnson, but the burglars actually stayed in the fancy hotel, which was the Watergate.
Interesting. Okay.
And had dinner in their fancy restaurant.
So let's go back to the wives. What happened? Did it arouse suspicion when Dorothy Hunt, when the money was recovered from the wreckage on her, in her purse, on her body?
Well, as you can see from that headline, Watergate paymistress murdered. I mean, that goes a little far, although the cause of the plane crash, and by the way, the crash happened at Midway Airport. So there's a local connection to it. Yes, it raised some questions as to what was she doing with that much cash in her purse, which was found in the wreckage. And of course, as we investigated, it became clear that she was probably carrying hush money that she would distribute to the defendants. A lot of people got hooked in on that. Howard Hunt's lawyer, who was at a very prominent firm, did not ever get indicted, but it was proven that he was distributing hush money. The brown paper bags of cash would be left, for those who remember what a bank of payphones is. There was a bank of payphones in the lobby of his office building, and someone would pick up the phone and call his office and say, "Come down, the bag is here." And he would come down and pick up a bag of cash and then distribute it to the defendants. And so, it's a long story about why he didn't get indicted, which I tell in the book, so you can read the story there.
Okay. So, all right, so that was Hunt's wife. Maureen Dean, known as Mo, was a fixture during the trial. She stood, or she sat behind her husband the entire time. I don't think anyone ever heard her say anything. She was completely poker faced. You could not detect any emotion whatsoever. And she's stunning. Here's a picture later. She had written a book. She was interviewed by Red Book magazine. And here is a picture that we believe is recent of what she looks like now. And if you have anything you want to add to that part?
Well, I've read both her books. She wrote 2 novels, and one is maybe not a novel. One is more her experience living through Watergate. The other is a novel. And she's actually very shy. And so as much as I've interacted with John, I've only had I've emailed with Mo. She was always part of the picture when he was testifying, and there's the picture of John Dean raising his hand, taking the oath before the Senate. My one observation of them interacting during the trial was, I now believe, a misinterpretation because they are still happily married. But right after his first cross-examination, so he had been put on the stand and testified for us, and then cross-examination started, and it was brutal. I mean, it was really, really awful. And when a break was called and John got off the stand and she was sitting just behind, she was in the courtroom, I saw what I perceived to be John Dean needing a hug. And I wanted her to give him a hug, but as he approached her, she froze. Her arms froze at her side, and he hugged her, and she was like stiff as a board. And I just felt so badly for him, and I wanted him to get a hug and to be reassured. And I just interpreted that as, oh, well, their marriage will never last, as opposed to my view of Gail, who, while I was preparing Jeb, I would arrange for her to come in and have lunch with him, and she would bring a picnic and they would eat together and talk. And so I thought they were happily married, who, shows how you never can tell.
You can never tell.
You can never tell what a marriage is unless you're in that marriage.
There's a question about what the burglars were looking for. And as I recall, this was the second burglary. The first time was they were putting in the wiretap, and now the second one was they were trying to remove it, right?
They were trying to fix it. They had put the wiretap on a lower level person's phone, thinking that it was the head of the DNC. And when they weren't getting any recordings from his phone, they didn't know if it just wasn't working, but they realized it was on the wrong phone. So they went back to make it work from his phone. There were rumors that, when you think about it, what could they have possibly thought they were going to get? Of course, we now have Manafort sharing polling data with the Russians. So maybe, of course, back then, I don't think there was so much great polling data. There was a totally false story that they were looking for evidence that would have incriminated Modine, in a prostitution ring. There is, I repeat this because it's so absurd.
That's ridiculous.
So we don't really know. I will tell you that if it hadn't been for the fact that there was so much money available, and back then, as unfortunately again now, because of Citizens United, but back then there was no limit on campaign contributions, and there was cash. People were donating cash, and it was in safes in the White House. Rosemary Woods had hundreds of thousands of dollars, which back then was really a lot of money, in a safe in her office. And if they had to think about, is this worth spending campaign money on? They never would have done this break-in, because I don't think they ever thought about, well, what's the point of doing it? It was a stupid idea. They had a bunch of other ideas that they presented to John Mitchell while he was still Attorney General. He was designated to become the head of the committee, but had still not moved over. And Liddy presented in the Attorney General's office. He put up an easel and presented Operation Gemstone, which included, for example, hiring a houseboat and wiring it for cameras and luring Democratic delegates who were going to be meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel, was the main hotel for the convention that year, onto this houseboat, filming them and then blackmailing them. Now, I don't know how they would have done all that, but John Mitchell said, $1 million, that's a lot. Just cut the budget. He didn't say, get out of my office, this is all illegal and stupid. He said, it's too much money. And then they cut the budget and he approved it. So, that was one of the key things that Jeb Magruder provided us with, because he was his deputy. So he knew that. And so anyway, that's and of course on this screen right now, below Maureen, is Martha Mitchell, who was as colorful a character as Hunt and Liddy. She was known for her phone calls. She made very strange phone calls at night to the media mostly, saying, I'm being held captive, I've been kidnapped, which probably was true, as we now know. But she really, I guess, was an embarrassment then to her husband. And I also witnessed, by the way, in the courtroom, even though they were estranged at the time of the trial, she did come as moral support for him and was there every day. And when the verdict was announced and he was pronounced guilty on all counts, she went over to console him, and he basically almost punched her. I mean, he just pushed her away in a violent fashion. And, I don't know how to interpret that. They were estranged, and it could have been, he'd just been convicted and was going to go to jail. And maybe he just wasn't ready for being comforted. But, that was a sad moment for me to witness.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel bad for Martha Mitchell because she was maligned.
Yes.
During the time.
Yeah.
They made her out to seem like she was crazy, but most of what she said actually happened. And
yes. That's what I mean. Sometimes it's true. People thought she was nutty and that none of this was real, but it was. And she did die shortly after of cancer. And so I just, maybe John should have been nicer to her. John Mitchell.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So before we go on to Rosemary, let's talk about, this is I told you I call this the good guy slide. Let's see if I can presenter view. No, not presenter view. Okay. Jill, can you see this?
I can see it. Yeah. It's
okay.
Archibald Cox, Judge Sirica, Leon Jaworski, Senator Ervin, who called himself the country lawyer, but he was really smart. Elliot Richardson is the last on the top row right, who was the Attorney General, and the Deputy Attorney Generals below him, William Ruckelshaus, who had been head of EPA before that. And both of them were fired on the night of the Saturday Night Massacre, which I assume we'll maybe talk about. And then the two women are Barbara Jordan and Elizabeth Holtzman, who were both on the House Judiciary Committee and played a pivotal role. Unfortunately, Barbara Jordan passed away, and I never got to know her, but Liz and I both served on a Pentagon committee looking at sexual assault in the military and became very good friends. And she also became the DA, a DA in New York, in Brooklyn, and is now in private practice in New York, and was the youngest member of Congress at the time, and certainly the youngest member of the Judiciary Committee. And both of them played key roles in the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And And she was also a commentator on the impeachment of Donald Trump.
Should we talk about
Sure.
and then we can come back to Rosemary and this picture, but because there have been questions about let me just stop the share.
So Rosemary, of course, comes up a little after the Saturday Night Massacre. And
the person who actually ended up firing Cox was Robert Bork.
Yes.
And I remember, in the book, one of the questions the lawyers asked him, why did you do it? And he said, well, I had 10 minutes to decide, and what was I going to do? But if he had resigned out of principle, what would have happened?
Richard Nixon would have appointed another acting attorney general who would have done it. And I've actually, because I've gotten to know Richardson and Ruckelshaus subsequent to this, have come to realize that both of them, and maybe just to make sure people know what the Saturday Night Massacre is, let me, if I can, set the stage for that. After we subpoenaed the tapes, the White House stonewalled. Nope, we're not giving you the tapes. You're not going to get them. And finally, we in the office decided that we needed to have a press conference and explain why we needed it. And this was sort of precipitated by Nixon suggesting a compromise known as the Stennis Compromise. Senator Stennis was nearly deaf. He had been assaulted and had been injured. And they wanted him to listen to the tapes with transcripts the White House would prepare and verify that the transcripts were accurate. Well, first of all, they're hard to hear even if you have the most acute hearing. Second of all, we know, and again, if you listen to the Chauvin trial, how easy it is to suggest to someone what is said on a hard to hear tape. When one of the witnesses was, yeah, it sounds like I ate too many drugs, as opposed to I ain't done no drugs, which is what actually is on the tape. And so, and thirdly, we could never use those transcripts as evidence. You need to have the tapes. That's the evidence. And so it would have been useless to get that interpretation. And so we said that is not a good compromise. And Archibald Cox, at the direction of our press officer, said, let's do a October 20th, Saturday morning, we'll have a press conference. John Dean had pled guilty on the 19th, on Friday. And that morning, we were having this press conference where Archibald Cox, if you ever want to see a man of integrity doing something, watch that tape, said to America, this is why we need them. This is why we have a right to them. And I was actually set to take a rare 2 days off to fly to New York for a family wedding. And as soon as the press conference was over, I said, I'm not going. And my team said, don't be silly. It's Saturday. What could possibly happen? Go ahead. You'll be back on Sunday night. And so I went to the airport, flew to New York. And when I got back from the wedding to the hotel I was staying at, the desk clerk ran out and said, you have a message, which said, the FBI has seized your offices, return immediately. So I had missed everything. There were no cell phones. I had no way of knowing until I got back. So I called one of my teammates who had sent the message to the hotel. And I flew back the first flight out on Sunday morning. And that was the Saturday Night Massacre. What had happened was the president said, I don't like how he's behaving about Cox. You hired him, Attorney General Richardson, fire him. And he said, I promised Congress when I was being confirmed that I would only fire him for cause. And I don't think there's any cause. He has a right to those tapes. He has a right to request them. The courts have said he has a right to them. I can't fire him. So president has the right to fire him. He did. That made the the deputy attorney general, Ruckelshaus, the acting attorney general. And he said, I too made that promise. And so he got fired. Then Bork, who was the Solicitor General, the number 3 person, took over, and he said, I didn't make that promise. And if I don't do this, there will be chaos. We need to protect the department. I'm going to do it so that there's some continuity. As a result of that, when he was nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, largely was not confirmed, aside from his conservative views. I think this played a real role in his not being confirmed. So that was a Saturday night massacre. That was October 20th. On October 23rd, 3 days later, the American public had responded so vociferously, mostly by old-fashioned snail mail. Our office was inundated with, if anybody can remember what a giant canvas sack of mail looks like. I mean, we're talking about stacks that are taller than I am. And I don't mean just sitting. I mean, when I'm standing up, we were inundated, as was the White House. And the president came to realize that he could not survive politically if he continued to refuse. So he said on October 23rd, okay, I will give you the tapes and I will appoint a new special prosecutor. So my first question is, well, why not just bring Archibald Cox back, unfire him? But he didn't. He appointed or nominated and got appointed Leon Jaworski, who as a result, we never quite trusted. Also, he had voted for Nixon, which was another reason. But mostly it was, why not bring back the person who you fired? And then we sat and waited for the tapes to be turned over. And it wasn't long after that. It was a week later. We were called to court around Halloween, where it was announced that there were 2 tapes missing. So we subpoenaed 9, and 2 were supposedly missing. Judge Sirica called a hearing in public rather than our investigating it through a secret grand jury. He said the American people have a right to know whether these were destroyed deliberately, and we're going to do this in public. So it was a sort of unique thing where the White House had to call witnesses to prove what had happened. And by that point, the senior lawyer on our team, Jim Neal, had left. He had been responsible for John Dean. And once John pled, he left, promising to return if Richard and I, the 2 younger people who were were trial lawyers, if we got an indictment, he would come back to help with the trial. So that meant that Rick, as I called him then and still do, but he's now known as Richard, it meant that we were in charge of this tapes hearing. And because I had learned my lesson at the Department of Justice that if I don't speak up, it's easy for someone else to take more than their fair share. I said to Rick at one point, I'm taking the next witness the White House calls, and then we're sharing equally after that. He said, oh, okay. And the next witness called was Rosemary Woods. But that was about the first 2 missing tapes, and she was just known as a chain of custody witness. It wasn't until the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so, like 3 weeks after this, that we were called back to court, and the White House said, well, there's a 3rd tape with a problem. It has an 18.5-minute gap where there should have been conversation. We can find no innocent explanation, and only Rosemary Woods can explain it. Well, since she had been my witness the first time, I assumed and acted on that she would be my witness now that she was being thrown under the bus by the White House and was considered now an obstruction of justice subject. So that's how we came to the tapes hearings and to my questioning Rosemary Woods.
Why don't you read the section of the book about this?
So
it's on the first page.
Oh, okay. All right. This is the prologue.
It's a very exciting few pages.
Okay. You tell me when to stop. I'll just read. This is the prologue, and it starts Washington, D.C., November 27th, 1973. So that was the Monday after Thanksgiving. And I had spent from the Wednesday to then preparing. I didn't think I was nervous, but I could barely breathe. President Richard Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, was on the stand in U.S. District Court demonstrating how she accidentally erased 18 and a half minutes from a key White House tape in the Watergate case, wiping out a conversation between the embattled president and one of his top aides just 3 days after the suspicious break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The chunky Universal tape recorder and headphones from Rose's White House office sat on the ledge of the witness box. A pedal that let her stop and start the machine with her foot rested on the floor. The bright, high-ceilinged courtroom, its wood-paneled walls burnished with years of crime and punishment, overflowed with lawyers, journalists, and spectators. From the bench, Judge John J. Sirica regarded me with a knowing expression. I felt he saw right through me. My face flushed, broadcasting my youth and vulnerability. The previous day, Rose had testified that she was in the middle of transcribing the tape from June 20, 1972, when the phone rang at the far end of her desk, and she answered the call while keeping her foot on the pedal. That, she said, must have erased the president's recorded conversation, replacing it with a steady hum. I asked her to demonstrate. She pushed the start button on her machine and placed her sturdy black pump on the pedal. The crowd fell silent at the blank demonstration tape as it began to whir. What did you do after the phone rang? I asked her, trying to keep my voice level. Rose glared at me. At 55, she was nearly twice my age, petite but fierce, dressed that day in a color-blocked turquoise, chartreuse, and orange sheath topped with a strand of pearls. A gold cross glinted from a ring on her right hand. I had to take those off first, she said in a hostile tone, delicately pointing to the headphones resting on the ledge. With that slight movement of her fingers, her foot lifted from the pedal. The tape stopped cold. Even if she'd mistakenly pushed record instead of stop, releasing the foot pedal when she answered the phone would have halted the tape, and there would be no 18 and a half minute gap. Rose had lied, and I had caught her. The crowd gasped, and a tsunami of journalists rushed from the courtroom, headed for the bank of payphones in the hall. But I did it that way in my office. It worked there, Rose stammered. Then maybe we should continue the demonstration in your office, I proposed. Amazingly, neither her lawyer nor those representing President Nixon objected to this suggestion. So that's what led to my encounter with her in the White House, adjacent to the Oval Office. It's what led to photographs of what was photographed in the White House of her demonstration being the front page of every newspaper and every news magazine at the time. And
around the world.
Around the world. In fact, one funny story was a British reporter came up to me and said, "Did you really mean to accuse her of being a communist?" I went, "What? What did I say?" You asked her, he said, if she was a lefty. And because of how she was using her hands, it seemed obvious to ask, do you use your right hand or your left hand? Are you a lefty? And so he had thought that meant that I was accusing her of being a communist, which of course I wasn't. And in writing this book, I really wanted to portray her more than as the cartoon she became. And I wanted to portray her as her family and friends knew her, but they all considered me the enemy, and they would hang up on me. And at one point, I actually got to meet Bob Woodward I'm talking about since I've lived in Chicago fairly recently. And he said, "Stop calling. It's too easy to hang up on you. You have to go in person and knock on the door. It's harder to slam the door in your face." So I flew to Washington to try to talk to one of her closest aides in the White House. And I got the door slammed in my face. So I wasn't successful until after the book came out. One of her grand nephews called me and said he would be happy to talk to me about her. And I have learned a lot from him that I think would have enriched my portrayal of her. And I consider possibly writing something about her to show what I learned.
I'd be interested to learn more about this because she seemed like a very sad character, that she devoted her life, her professional life, but really her whole life, because she never married, she never had kids.
Yeah.
She worked all kinds of crazy hours for the president.
Mm-hmm.
She was a friend to Pat and their children. And
She was Aunt Rose to them.
And didn't she and Pat share clothes?
They did. They exchanged clothing. And her brother, who was the sheriff of Cook County, Joe Woods, and Richard Nixon exchanged suits. I don't know they exchanged. Joe Woods got Richard Nixon's suits. So yeah, I mean, she considered herself part of the family. And then, part of trying to describe her, I asked people like John Dean, who saw her every day. I mean, he saw the president, and you go past Rose to see the president. So I said, did you ever go to her apartment? Yeah. I said, what did it look like? I don't know. Well, where did she shop? Who were her friends? Tell me something. He said, Jill, after I said, good morning, Rose, that was it. We didn't have a conversation. I said, what? You called her Rose? She's always been known to me as Rosemary Woods. And he said, yeah, everybody called her Rose. So that's why I called her Rose in the book. So that was something I learned from him. But basically, I talked to as many people. I talked to Steve Bull. I talked to Alex Butterfield. And they're men. They just didn't notice, like, what did her apartment look like? Now I know from her grandnephew.
But you did say that, she was very religious. She went to church almost every day.
Yes.
She was a great dancer. She had a wonderful social life in Washington, going to a lot of Kennedy Center events. Yes. She probably went to some White House fancy dinners. But
it was interesting because, I mean, that was all from contemporaneous reporting, not from any personal conversations. Right. And, I know she grew up in a small town, Sebring, Ohio, and supposedly left and moved to Washington out of sadness at the death of her fiance after she graduated high school. That, I mean, as far as I know, that was the end of her education. And it's unclear whether he died of meningitis or of something to do with the Korean War. She came to Washington, which is a pretty brave thing to do, and got a job at the House of Representatives, and then moved over when Nixon became a senator to work for him as a senator. She ultimately lived at the Watergate, in the condominium portion of the Watergate, which I find completely ironic. She was escorted to all these fancy events by Bob Gray, who was a very well-known PR person and also very well-known as gay, which, of course, given that she never married, made me wonder. And her grandnephew, I actually had the courage to ask him about that. And he said, no, but she taught us, he described their family as extremely conservative Catholics who were homophobic, would be, I'd say, how he would have described it.
That was the question you were going.
Yeah, I mean, just in trying to find out, after he described what her apartment looked like, how she dressed, more about her personally, I raised this issue of her never marrying and of being escorted by Bob Gray, who was not, I mean, back then, no one was publicly gay, but
right.
In Washington, it was well known. And subsequent to his death, it was very well known. So I asked him, and he said, no, she actually taught us tolerance and understanding, and we came to like him a lot and understand and accept. So, but he had no knowledge about whether she was gay or whether she was known as the office wife of Richard Nixon. And she was totally, and I will say, I listened to tapes of Richard Nixon and Rosemary Woods speaking that weren't part of the case, but just you can go to the National Archives and look up these things. And she was not what would have been considered a secretary back then. She was an advisor to Richard Nixon. He relied on her for guidance on things. I'll give you one example, not where he was asking guidance, but when the three Republicans came to him after the smoking gun tape was released, and they said, you have to resign or you will be convicted in the Senate at a trial. And he decided he would resign. He was afraid to tell Pat and Julie and Tricia, his daughters and wife. And he went to Rose and said, you have to tell them I'm resigning. That's the kind of relationship they had. She played a role, if anybody remembers Checkers, where he was thinking about resigning because his Checkers speech did not go well, and resigning from the ticket where he was vice presidential candidate to Eisenhower. And she said, I would have never delivered that letter. Someone came up to her and said, you can't deliver that. She said,
Right.
kidding. Of course I would.
It was a resignation letter.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And she didn't
Exactly.
go through with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, she was completely undervalued and underpaid. And then after he left, she was out of a job. And
well, she stayed on for a while for President Ford, but she was obviously moved out of the Oval Office area and moved across the street to the old executive office building. And she kept a shrine to Nixon, a cigar that had been left half smoked and other things. And then eventually she was moved to Lafayette Park, which is now known as George Floyd or Black Lives Matter Park. And she was really cut off. And then she returned to Sebring, where she eventually was in a nursing home and passed away.
Did she ever go out to California to see?
I suspect she went out to see. She never worked for him again. She did work for him in New York. You know, he lost. He ran for governor and lost, and then he went to New York and was in private practice. And she did work for him there. But yeah, I you know, if I could have, I would have asked her, how come you never, you know, went to work for him? And so, but she described being, you know, going from being an A-lister to being not an A-lister, you know, not being invited to any events and not being allowed to even read or send his mail to him. It was a pretty sad ending for someone who had been so good to him.
Was she resentful?
There's no evidence of that. She seemed to accept it. At one point, someone saw her walking to the Watergate, which isn't that far from the White House. I mean, it's a healthy walk, but it's not ridiculous. And they said, you know, she used to, of course, go in government cars. Why aren't you taking a taxi? And she said, I can't afford it anymore. But she could still afford to live in the Watergate, so it couldn't have been that bad.
Yeah, it made me sad to see her so badly dumped on.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Which doesn't mean she, you know, deserved my sympathy when she was on the stand saying that she had erased a tape, which I do not believe she erased. Although I do believe she may have believed she erased it, and that Richard Nixon, in an act of complete evil, let her believe she had done, when he must have known that it was him or Haldeman who did it, or maybe Al Haig.
Ugh.
Anyway, she made me feel like Perry Mason, because anybody who remembers Perry Mason, every night he would cross-examine someone and they would admit, it wasn't your client, it was me. And that doesn't happen in real life. But here it literally did happen. That
But you also talk about how you were nervous because you were asking her a question you didn't know the answer to. And I mean, that must have been really...
Well, anyone who's a lawyer on this call, and probably anybody who's ever studied anything about law, knows the first rule of cross-examination is never ask a question you don't know the answer to.
Right.
But in this situation, all I knew was that I had been called on Wednesday to the courthouse to be told that only Rose could explain this 18.5-minute gap. And I had no idea what she would say. But the only thing I could do was to say, how did it happen, Rose? And, well, Miss Woods, how did it happen? And to listen to her and listen carefully so that I could cross-examine what she was saying, and to prepare by reading everything she had said before. And one of the best lines I had was, my first time questioning her, I had just, not for any particular reason, said, well, when you handled the tapes, were you told any special precautions you should take to prevent erasing anything? I had no idea she was going to then claim she had. And the tapes she was talking about weren't erased. And she yelled at me. She was really hostile, saying, I used my head. It was the only thing I had to use. And of course, she looked like a fool when I could later use that to say, well, you said that you used your head to avoid erasing, but you were lying then because you did erase. And so that was a prescient question that, turned out to be really a good background for cross-examination when she told her story.
Okay.
Someone is saying boo-hoo for her, no sympathy whatsoever.
Okay, you talk about going to an event at the Kennedy Center where I think you bumped into Elliot Richardson. He was like kidding you. I lost my job because of you. And then
no, that's two different events.
Different.
The one at the Kennedy Center.
Is that where you danced with Gerald Ford?
No, that's a third event. The one at Kennedy Center was where I met Nancy Haunchman Dickerson, who had been one of my role models and inspirations. I had met her when I was a freshman at the University of Illinois, and she was an NBC correspondent. And my undergraduate degree became journalism in part because of her, in part because of Anthony Lewis. The event with Elliot Richardson was right after Watergate. There was a club known as the Gridiron Club, which was all male journalists. And the women's movement was finally getting some power. And a group decided that they would boycott the Gridiron Club until they allowed female journalists to be members. And we held a carnival where Martha Mitchell sold this was to raise money for women journalists. Martha Mitchell sold phone calls. You would pay a price, and she would call anyone anywhere in the world that you wanted. Dan Rather and I were selling kisses, candy kisses, although some people insisted on the real thing. And Elliot Richardson, who was known for his doodles, was selling a doodle of equal justice. And for an extra fee, he would sign it. And so you would write your name down and hand it to him. And he was just routinely signing. And when I handed him mine, he actually looked up and said, oh my God, I know you. I lost my job because of you. And so that was sort of charming. And then there was another event um, that Richard and I attended. And I ended up dancing with the new president, Gerald Ford.
Well, he wasn't president then.
He was the new he was appointed vice president when Spiro Agnew had to resign because he was a criminal too. So I mean, it was pretty corrupt there, I guess. And Rick goaded me into going over, and I'm actually, no one believes this, but I'm actually quite shy, and I would never walk up to someone like that. And but I also will take almost any dare from Rick, and probably from most people, but certainly from Rick. I would never let him dare me to do something and not do it. That's how I called Art Buchwald too, was on a dare from Rick. So I went over to just say, and Rick said, and I want you to tell him what we know, because if he knew what we know, he would not be defending the president. Of course, I did not do that you can imagine the reasons why I would not have done that. But I did go over to talk to him, and he asked me to dance. And so I danced with him at this big fancy event.
Was he a good dancer?
Yes, he was, although he was known as quite clumsy.
That was only from Saturday Night Live.
It does.
An athlete. He was an athlete.
He was, but he actually did trip quite a lot. So, I mean, there are pictures of him, unfortunately, that look like the one episode with our current president tripping as he was going up the stairs to Air Force One, which isn't as bad as our last president walking up with toilet paper on his shoe.
Yes. Are you, do you believe that there was something worked out where they convinced Nixon to resign, knowing that he would be pardoned later?
No, I don't. I was on a panel at the Gerald Ford Library in Grand Rapids with the man who delivered the pardon offer and Gerald Ford's son, one of his sons. And although he was hurt by pardoning Nixon, and there was rumors rife that as we tried to convince Leon Jaworski that now that Nixon wasn't president, and by the way, we tried to convince him while he was president that we should indict him, the compromise there was that we would give a roadmap to impeachment to the Judiciary Committee instead of indicting him, and we would name him an unindicted co-conspirator. Once he resigned, I was right back in Leon's office saying, okay, you said we couldn't do it because it would interfere with his doing his job as president. He's not president, he's a citizen. We can indict him. And as we argued about, well, then the trial would be delayed, which it probably would have been because the trial was scheduled for less than a month after that, and he would clearly need time to prepare. And we all said, fine, we'll come back whenever the trial's, held. We'll take a leave and, go do other jobs and come back. And in that time period, he got pardoned, which basically ended any possibility of indicting and trying him. And I sometimes wonder if he had been indicted, whether the message would have been a lot stronger to future occupants of the White House that you cannot get away with doing illegal acts. And maybe we would have had something different going forward. But it didn't happen. We weren't allowed to do it. He got pardoned. And one of the reasons that he was not elected in his own right, Gerald Ford, when he ran after the completion of Nixon's term, that he wasn't elected was in part because of people not forgiving him for pardoning Richard Nixon. But I believe, based on everything I've heard from the other two men, that it was an act of courage on his part. And the Kennedy Foundation gave him a Profiles in Courage Award for doing it. I think he acted out of his own sense of, let's put this behind us, let's move on. And I don't know that it was the right decision. I wouldn't have made it, but I understand it and don't hold him accountable for it.
He has a unique place in history.
Yes.
He's the only unelected president.
Well, and he was only, he's the first one appointed under the 25th Amendment, which was passed because of the Kennedy assassination. Lyndon Johnson, who was the vice president, became president, but he did not have a vice president because there was no mechanism for appointing one. So that's how the 25th Amendment got passed.
Interesting. You talk in the book about the current state of politics and how, in your opinion, Donald Trump is so much worse than Nixon. Do you want to elaborate?
Well, I don't talk about it in the book. It's in the epilogue.
Well,
and the epilogue was written, I mean, it is in the book, but it's...
That's what I meant.
Yeah, it's the epilogue. And I wrote it literally as the book was being printed because I wanted it to be as current as I could and worried that whatever I said was going to be overtaken by events. Luckily, I think it still holds true. And so that's the first time I ever mentioned Trump is in the epilogue. And I focus a lot on the media environment because during Watergate, there were only 3 television stations, NBC, ABC, CBS. There were, mainstream media. There was no Fox News, none of that stuff. There was no social media. And all of the channels and all of the newspapers had the same facts. They might have different opinions in the editorial page about those facts, but no one debated that truth was truth. And the issue we have now, and last night I happened to watch Trevor Noah, who had, I can't think of his name, the person who works for him, who interviewed Trump supporters at Trump rallies. And they live in a different world than I live in. They believe things that I know because I don't read just the newspaper. If someone gets indicted, I read the indictment. If someone says, well, Connor versus Graham, which was part of the Chauvin trial, I read that lawsuit. I read the Supreme Court decision. And so I know when I'm reading reports, what's true and what's not. And that's one of the biggest differences and one of the biggest problems facing America now is how do we talk to each other? How do we show people who listen to only Fox News that they aren't getting accurate facts? And there's 2 defamation cases now that I think could help. Smartmatic sued Fox and several of its hosts on the news side, not on the opinion side, as well as Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, two lawyers for Trump, 2 conspiracy believers, 2 people who have propagated the big lie about fraud in the election, and as has Dominion. And they are suing on the grounds that they are repeating lies by putting people like Giuliani and Powell on air and repeating that there was fraud when they know there isn't. So, for example, in the Smartmatic one, Smartmatic actually had machines in LA County, period, end. Nowhere else. Now, no one suspects that LA County was ever going to go for Trump. And they went on air and claimed that Smartmatic's machine was set to flip the votes from Trump to Biden and that they changed the outcome of the national election. Now, of course, that's absurd. They only had machines in 1 county. They couldn't have affected the election. And they sued, Smartmatic sued for $1.3 billion, which is the annual profit of Fox. That could have a real effect on whether Fox is willing to keep putting fake news on. So that's an interesting prospect where we might start getting truth from, or what I would identify as truth, and that people listening to Fox would then no longer think that there was a grounds for insurrection on January 6th. So I think that's an important thing that we need to look at. And I talk a little about some of the things that happened. And information's still coming out. The Treasury Department just sanctioned Russia and Kalimnik, who Manafort was the campaign manager, but an associate of his was Konstantin Kalimnik. They worked together on helping Russia in Ukraine. And it's just been revealed. We knew that Manafort gave very sensitive polling data to Kalimnik. But why did he do that? What was Kalimnik going to do? Well, Kalimnik turned it over to Russian intelligence, which we know hacked into things and tried to change the outcome of the election. So we now know that there was collusion between Manafort, the Trump campaign, and Russia. So that's pretty dramatic new revelation, is that the Mueller report said there was obstruction of justice that prevented us from being able to conclude that there was collusion. Well, now we have that evidence. So I don't know whether there'll be another case charging obstruction and collusion, but it's at least nice to have that information now.
Do you think there's still an appetite to carry the investigation into January 6th?
It's interesting because, of course, we're all reading now that the independent commission to investigate is fading from possibility. I think it's extremely important to do. I would like to see it in the same way we had the 9/11 commission, or even going to a congressional hearing like the Irvin Committee hearing. I fear that the Irvin Committee style might not work because we are so polarized now that it might take an independent commission to investigate. And I think it's worth doing. I don't think we should let it go, because the only way to prepare for preventing it in the future is to know exactly what happened and how it happened, to get the facts out. And I think that the facts are pretty dramatic and have been very well laid out by, a number of the news media that have done programs on it. There is a documentary being made about January 6th by a very good director that I've been in touch with. And, I think the story will come out somehow, some way. And I always think that transparency is the best cleanser. I'm on the board of the Better Government Association here in Chicago. And of course, one of our prime missions is, FOIA, OMA, the Open Meetings Act, and transparency in government. I think it really works. And so I'm hoping that the facts will come out.
Speaking of, well, you brought up movies. Katie Holmes just optioned your book, and she's going to be portraying you in a movie. That is so exciting.
It is. It's quite incredible to me. And it's been fun getting to, talk to her. And she's interviewing screenwriters now to convert it into a script. And she's very smart, and she clearly loved the book. And, we talk about it, and she quotes things to me from the book. So and I've watched every movie she's made now, before I agreed that, to allow this. And she's done some amazing roles from her youth to now. So it's a lot of fun, and I get to be a consultant, and I get to be a producer, whatever that means.
That's exciting.
So, yeah.
Will you get a cameo role?
I don't know. I mean, what would I play? Maybe a juror, or maybe I could play a journalist, because I'm
or a judge or something.
Or something. Well, yeah, there's only Judge Sirica in the case. But yeah, I could be a journalist.
I hope you do get a cameo.
Yeah, that would be fun. That would be fun.
We could, how are you for time? Do you have
Well,
time for...
I think we probably must be boring the audience by now. I mean,
No, we still have almost 300 people still here.
Oh my God.
Can I ask you, let me ask you a couple more questions.
Lauren and I were supposed to go for a walk, but she's listening, I think, so she'll know we aren't walking now.
The pin you're wearing, that's the, if I recall, the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers pin.
Yes.
Where the woman is doing everything the man's doing, except she's doing it in high heels and backwards.
Exactly. And that was a title I originally considered for my book. And when I saw this pin, it was at the Randolph Street Market. For all of you who don't know about it, it's a fabulous, on the last weekend of each month, although it hasn't been held recently because of COVID, but I'm hoping by the summer, the outdoor part at least will be opened. When I saw it, I knew I had to have this pin, because to me it said dancing backwards in high heels. And the book has really two themes. One, of course, is, my unique perception of Watergate from a woman's perspective. But the other is the hurdles that women of that era, and today still, have to overcome to be considered half as good. And so dancing backwards in high heels represented to me the hurdles and obstacles in the way of women succeeding. And that didn't make it to be the title of the book. The publisher actually chooses the cover photograph and the title. And when that was suggested, I said, I will not allow girl to be part of the title. I hate being called a lady lawyer or the mini-skirted lawyer, and being called girl, that's horrible. No. And my editor, who is a fabulous, wonderful, incredible editor, said, what captures the era better than girl? And as soon as he said that, I went, it's true. I was called girl. And, in reading the book, pay attention to how many times someone said to me, you can't do that. You're a girl. And I thought, okay. I still was a little uncomfortable with it. I now fully embrace it and think it is absolutely the best title I could have come up with. But I was at first uncomfortable with it. And the second thing he said to me, by the way, was, think of how many books with the woman with the word girl in it are bestsellers. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Girl on the Train. And I thought about it and thought, well, I've never written a book before. I don't know what sells. He's a professional. I should take his advice in the same way that I would expect my clients to take my advice. So I went with it, and I love the title. I'm fine with it.
Good. Before we go, do you want to say anything about the Derek Chauvin trial?
Well, hopefully someone is watching their phone and nothing has happened. The jury hasn't come back. Tell me on chat. Anybody, if you think someone has a question about the military. But
we could.
Yeah, no, okay.
There are enough questions. I could keep talking for 2 hours with you.
I'll answer this one. So I can't predict the outcome, because we do have a history of acquittals, but we also have Laquan McDonald and the conviction of the officer involved in that shooting. We have probably the strongest case ever. This was not a split-second decision. This was something he could have stopped at any time up to 3 minutes before the death. You want to say something?
Yes, I'm reading on my phone. The jury reached a verdict in the
What?
trial of
Oh.
Derek Chauvin, who is charged with murder in George Floyd's death. It will be read in an hour. It has not been read yet. It will be read between 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. Central.
Oh my God. Okay, so what time is it? It is now
It is
quarter to
2:40. Yes.
Oh my God. Okay, everybody turn on your televisions real soon.
So you'll be on TV tonight.
Oh my God, this is fantastic. They actually just canceled. There was supposed to be a live thing after the verdict, and the program I was supposed to be on canceled that. So I don't know whether I'll be on, but whoa, I will now predict that it's a conviction, because, and I will also point out that in Watergate, it was a one-day verdict. And there were more defendants and more counts than one defendant and 3 counts. I think the prosecution was nearly perfect. I cannot think of anything they could have done that they didn't, or anything they did that they shouldn't have. I think the defense failed to even nick the prosecution evidence. I think they opened up things like, maybe there's another way he murdered him, by putting his head at the tailpipe of a car and exposing him to carbon monoxide. Why did they bring that up? That wasn't part of the prosecution case. I think that Nelson, the defense lawyer, misstated the law, which is bad. Fowler, who was their chief medical witness, made some mistakes that, lead a jury, and I would have argued, if I was making the closing for the prosecution, that if he was wrong about the possibility of carbon monoxide killing him, can you trust anything else he said? And I've had a trial where someone, made a big boo-boo on saying something, and I was able to call a rebuttal witness, much as the prosecution did here with calling Tobin. And I heard a juror say, oh my gosh, she caught him, the defendant, in in a lie, an outright lie. And I knew then, one lie by the defendant, and they don't trust anything else the defendant said. So I think that there were enough mistakes made. And that's so interesting. Oh my gosh. Well,
they kept talking about the being fearful of the crowd and the aggression.
Then he's in the wrong line of work. I'm sorry. If you're afraid of a crowd of people who are standing on the curb, taking your picture and saying, save his life, get off him, you're in the wrong business. I once got a ticket in front of my house in Evanston for opening my door. I was parked in front of my house. I opened the door, and a policeman said I scared him when I opened the door. And I almost said to him, you're in the wrong line of work if you were afraid of me opening the door. I didn't, because I thought that would probably...
You got a ticket?
I did. There is such a thing. Yes. I can't remember what it was for, but yes, I did. Because
he didn't look afraid at all. His expression did not change for the 9.5 minutes.
Exactly.
And it's painful to watch.
There were 5 officers. There were 4 others besides him. They had guns. They had mace. They had billy clubs, whatever you call those sticks. They could have called for backup. They're just, the crowd was not scary to me.
And Tobin was the Chicago pulmonologist.
Tobin was from Loyola, and Rich was from Northwestern. 2 of the experts, the heart. Tobin was pulmonary, and Rich was heart. And honestly, if Tobin had been my science teacher, I would have been a doctor instead of a lawyer. He was so good.
He was good. Okay, people. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions and comments. There were so many, and
Thank you all. I mean, these were great questions. You did a great job, Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lauren, thank you so much. I'm sorry you're not going to get to go for your walk today because I think you're going to be watching TV.
I'm going to be watching TV.
Thank you.
Unless we walk right now before the announcement.
Okay, that's between you and Lauren. But thank you for your government service, for what you did to, along with your team, to defend our democracy. And I hope that people today learn those lessons. It's very fragile, and I know there are a lot of very earnest, hardworking, loyal government servants, and we just have to hope that those people get to be heard. So,
yes.
But Jill has two podcasts.
I do. I hope you will all follow us. One is hashtag, and hashtag is part of the name, hashtag Sisters-in-Law, with Joyce Vance, Barb McQuaid, and Kimberly Atkins, who are all MSNBC analysts. And then one that I do called Intergenerational Politics, although we've just been taken on by a professional production company, and we may have a new name, probably something like IG or something politics. But I do it with an 18-year-old UCLA freshman who I met when he was 17, and we were both running as Biden delegates in the Illinois primary. And he is so smart. And if you watch that podcast, you will not believe that he is 18 years old.
I've listened to it. It's very, very good.
I mean, it's amazing. And the most amazing is that we come up with ideas for guests and they all say yes. And they are amazing, amazing guests. I mean, the most recent one was Julian Castro. Before that was Delegate Plaskett, the representative from the Virgin Islands, who was an impeachment manager who was, oh my God, she was the star of the impeachment. Cy Vance is, I think, our next one, the DA from New York. We also had Letitia James, who's the Attorney General of New York. We had James Comey. We had Madeleine Albright, one of my heroes, who's a pin wearer. She has a book called Read My Pins. But of course, she's also a very serious person. We talked about her book about fascism, but we also talked about her book about pins. And so it's just been great. And we had, I mean, people have written saying, your interview of Mary Trump was the best interview I've ever heard of her, because we talked to her as a psychologist, not as a political analyst, but as a, as what her expertise is, as the niece and as a psychologist. And so we sort of try to just get to know the person we're talking to. And sometimes there's a current news hook, but a lot of times it's really just who are the people making the news and making policy in America. So it's been an extraordinary, wonderful experience to do this.
I'm really happy for you and thrilled, because this is a great sort of next phase of your career. And it's coming full circle because you wanted to be in journalism from the beginning.
Yeah.
So this has been really wonderful. Thank you everyone for your patience, and sorry for, the technical glitches. But what can I say?
Thank you for putting together that presentation. It was a great set of slides.
I will send it to you.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much. Next week, our speaker is Deb Wolf, who is, to be honest, I don't really know a lot about what she's going to be talking about, except she works in this underground scientific facility and in South Dakota, and she's going to be telling us all about it. And so it sounds like she has a really cool job and she loves it and she's enthusiastic, a great presenter. So we'll both be learning at the same time. Thank you, Jill, for everything.
Thank
It
you,
was
Wendy. Thank
really
you, audience.
wonderful. Folks, go to your independent bookstores and buy this
Yes.
book.
And
All
if
right.
you want, I just will say, if you want a personalized copy, Bookends and Beginnings, also in Evanston, in Bookman's Alley, just between Sherman and, in that little alley there, opposite the CVS. If you order it in advance, then they call me and I go in and I personalize the books.
Yep.
So
And we know Nina, she was our very first virtual Levy lecturer.
Okay, did she talk about her book? Because she has a great book.
Yes, she talked about, yes, that was the very first time the pandemic had just started, and we were flying blind, but hopefully it's gotten
She's terrific, and I love that that bookstore exists. So
yes,
we want to support real bookstores.
Absolutely. And she just filed a lawsuit against
she did against Amazon.
Yes. So good luck with that.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm going to watch TV right now. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.